doing something like a show at the Garden,
right,
that people leave saying, wow, that was a really, really interesting music show.
And you did this piece of performance art at the Garden during your live show.
We did it at some of the biggest kind of venues in the world. The energy in those rooms was electric, because I think people, we'll get into the cancellation of the future, but I think that when people go to environments and they experience something that is even in a small way new, it's very exciting. And I think that I just wanted to do something that felt a bit more reflective of what media is like now. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And how it makes you feel. It's difficult to kind of explain the show, but one of the things that I had to become aware of is that we're like quite a big band,
right?
And there's what I'm interested in. One of the things that I think that is important for me is to take more academic ideas from my peers or my friends, like you or Tremello, whoever it was, and kind of present them in an understandable and kind of appropriate way within pop music. So, you know, the reason that we didn't want to do a show at a gallery or something like that is not just because of our resentment for institutions now and art galleries, but also is because I wanted to do it in an environment that had a large audience and kind of was, as much as I could make high or art with a broad appeal, you know, because it's actually ironic that as long as there's groups of people like me thinking the same way, you've kind of got more chance now of going to a rock show and experiencing a real piece of art than you do going to a museum.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the great irony, and this is similar to what you mentioned before, of as Fisher describes, the slow cancellation of the future.
So for my fans, your fans will know all about that.
Sure,
just explain that, because this is a theory that me and you riff on all the time.
Yeah. Hauntology, slow cancellation of the future. These are ideas that are coming from a pop culture theorist, let's say pop culture political theorist named Mark Fisher, whose famous book, Capitalist Realism, written in the fallout from 2008, kind of explores this problem of the 21st century of not having a political alternative. Socialism was defeated. It's capitalism from here on and forever. What Fisher is writing about is the developmental arc of neoliberalism. When we talk about lost futures, there's a perpetual nostalgia for the 80s. Now, what happened in the 1980s? It was Reagan in my country and Thatcher where you grew up, and the Volcker shock with profound interest rates and shoring up of the money supply, and the advent of neoliberalism in which everybody got a lot more poor and started to work harder for less. And so the kind of utopian imaginaries, the optimistic visions of the future that had emerged in the 60s, 70s leading up until that point began to recede from popular culture. If you look at the kind of imaginaries of, like, you know, I think of the original series of Star Trek, which I grew up watching, like they had communism in the future, they had post-scarcity. It's like, yeah, it was like utopia. People just pursue their own intellectual interests. No one wants for anything. They have replicators that just like 3D print their food all of a sudden. And the future imaginaries of the 21st century are things that are like totally dystopian. They're all falling apart. It's all like, you know, the future has extreme wealth disparity and people are living in poverty, and we're uploading our brains to the internet, and then the robots are going to kill us. That's the future imaginary that we have now. This slow cancellation of the future, something that you and I talk about a lot, corresponds to aesthetic stagnation on top of the political and economic stagnation, in that the amount of creative risk that people could take in previous generations was proportionately more. And that was mostly because the wage floor was high, the cost of living was low, and so the total amount of decommodified time, like you could spend 25, 30% of your time just making punk music or doing your weird art practice, and you never have to worry if you like sell that album or you sell that painting, and you can just kind of experiment and, like, you know, experience the joy of creating stuff, aesthetic pleasure, and so on. And as society has become more and more privatized over the course of neoliberalism, the total amount of free time that people have to pursue creative practices is basically that has disappeared from contemporary life.
Yeah, and what it's created is this hyper-commodified sphere of art where the only art that is worth making or is possible to make is art that is successful financially or does numbers.
Has to be immediately successful.
Has to be immediately successful. So yeah, listen, you're so articulate, and what you just said had all of the information, but some people might have to watch that about 3 or 4 times. What you're kind of saying is that, like, in like the 90s, you could have a job in the service industry and you could work as a musician at night. Do you know what I mean? The economy allowed you to do 2 things. So you could make experimental music that went out to a certain group of people, and you could work in a coffee shop, and you could afford rent.
Exactly.
So the economy allowed for you to do that. Phoebe Buffay was the ultimate pop culture example of that kind of economic result of a type of artist. When, like you said, once neoliberalism kind of started to totally decay any socially democratic aspects of society, and your art funding went away and stuff like that, young people were forced to, well, there was actually this really interesting thing that happened, that when we were growing up in the 90s, the one thing you didn't do was sell out. So if you were making just enough money to live off your art, don't sign the check for Nike, because you're kind of getting into bed with consumer capitalism that our, at the time, community of artists is fighting against. Once it was so obvious that consumer capitalism and the marching horizonless kind of motion of neoliberalism had won, young people had to change this idea from selling out to getting the bag.
Yes.
So now you get the bag.
Yeah. That was the millennial experience. It's like, I'm a bootstrapping entrepreneur.
This is it, right? So I think that what happened was that young people became encouraged to make art for money. And the art that young people can make for money is homogenous art for big companies. So for example, the most creative young graphic designer now is probably just making some flat design for an internet startup. Do you know what I mean? Because that's the only thing that they can afford to do. You have that issue. And then from a kind of class issue, which isn't so much of a thing that I see spoken about in America, because you have such a huge middle class that's very different. But I was brought up in an incredibly class-orientated environment. Like my dad I come from a kind of second generation upper middle class, and my dad was a welder who became a stand-up comedian, and then he became an actor in this TV show called Our Vida Sein Pet, and it was a show about Thatcher's the era of kind of the loss of subsidization of industry in the north of England, and all of these working class, blue collar men and communities of men having to go to Germany to work to make money. And this show, it was a comedy, and my dad kind of became like a political, cultural figurehead. So I grew up in all of this kind of anti-Thatcher, very much aware of how social mobility worked. And the social mobility in my family was acquired through art. Now, the issue that we have now with neoliberalism is neoliberalism has decayed, this is a Fisher thing, but has decayed any socially democratic aspect of society that previously allowed the working class to be a dominant part of the cultural production of our society. So basically, poor people used to be able to do that. So my dad was a welder, right? And he one day downed tools and wanted to be a stand-up comedian. And from the government, just by asking them, got enough money to buy an ambulance. And him and his friend decided to do the first ever. They were touring comedians in comedy clubs where toothless henchmen would be like, I'll give you 20 pence to make me laugh. You'd be like, fucking hell. And they were like, fuck it, let's go and do a play in these environments. So they would put a small set in an ambulance, and they would drive to the Dunstan Working Man's Social Club.
Incredible.
And they would do a play to these confused people. But what that turned into was a company that still exists on the quayside in Newcastle called the Live Theatre Company. And it still is a environment that invites young people to come in and experiment with theatre. Now,
Incredible.
those kind of things just aren't funded now. So
Right,
we have these
right.
these physical monuments that I actually kind of go to see. What's the word when you religiously go and
Pilgrimage.
see? I almost go on pilgrimages to these monuments
Right.
to see not only what my dad created, but what the kind of economy and the social fabric that I was brought up in, and I was kind of promised.
Right.
Created.
That's the lost future
That's
right
the lost
there.
future right there. And so what I have been really interested in over the past couple of years is we lost Fisher tragically in 2017 in the only way I think he could have gone. I would have been really interested to see what he thought about my band, because I couldn't articulate these ghosts in our society that we can all feel, but we don't really know how to put our finger on. What he was basically saying, for a lot of people who don't know his work, is that the 21st century is defined by its inability to articulate itself aesthetically and politically. Fisher puts it, the 21st century is just the 20th century on higher resolution screens. And
Indeed it is.
And